Generations of human beings have been divided into 8 categories based on the timeline they were born in. The Lost Generation. The Lost Generation is generally defined as people born from 1883 to 1900, coming of age in either the 1900s or the 1910s. The term is also particularly used to refer to a group of American expatriate writers living in Paris during the 1920s. Gertrude Stein is credited with coining the term, and it was subsequently popularized by Ernest Hemingway, who used it in the epigraph for his 1926 novel The Sun Also Rises, "You are all a lost generation." In the wake of the Industrial Revolution, Western members of the Lost Generation grew up in societies that were more literate, consumerist, and media-saturated than ever before, but which also tended to maintain strictly conservative social values. Young men of the cohort were mobilized on a mass scale for World War I, a conflict that was often seen as the defining moment of their age group's lifespan. Young women also contributed to and were affected by the war, and in its aftermath gained greater freedoms politically and in other areas of life. The Lost Generation was also heavily vulnerable to the Spanish flu pandemic and became the driving force behind many cultural changes, particularly in major cities during what became known as the Roaring Twenties. The Greatest Generation, also known as the GI Generation or the World War II generation, is generally defined as people born from 1901 to 1927. They were shaped by the Great Depression and were in the primary generation composing the enlisted forces in World War II. Members of this generation experienced much of their youth with rapid technological innovations, for example, radio, telephone, automobile, amidst growing levels of worldwide income inequality and a soaring economy. After the stock market crash of 1930s, they experienced profound economic and social turmoil. Despite the hardships, historians note that the literature, arts, music, and cinema of the period flourished. This generation experienced what is commonly referred to as the Golden Age of Hollywood. A number of popular film genres, including gangster films, musical films, comedy films, and monster films, attracted mass audiences. The Great Depression also greatly influenced literature and witnessed the advent of comic books, which were popular with members of this generation, with such characters as Doc Savage, The Shadow, Superman, and Batman. Next to jazz, blues, gospel music, and folk music, swing jazz became immensely popular with members of this generation. Over 16 million Americans served in World War II, the majority being members of this generation. The generation is generally defined as people born from 1928 to 1945. By this definition and US Census data, there were 23 million silents in the United States as of 2019. In the United States, the Great Depression of the 1930s and World War II in the early to mid-1940s caused people to have fewer children, and as a result, the generation is comparatively small. It includes most of those who fought during the Korean War. Upon coming of age in the post-war era, silents were sometimes characterized as trending towards conformity and traditionalism, as well as comprising the silent majority. However, they have also been noted as forming the leadership of the civil rights movement and the 1960s counterculture and creating the rock and roll music of the 1950s and 1960s. Baby Boomers. The generation is often defined as people born from 1946 to 1964 during the mid-20th century baby boom. The dates, the demographic context, and the cultural identifiers may vary by country. In Europe and North America, many boomers came of age in a time of increasing affluence and widespread government subsidies in post-war housing and education, and grew up generally expecting the world to improve with time. Those with higher standards of living and educational levels were often the most demanding of betterment. In the early 21st century, baby boomers in some developed countries are the single biggest cohort in their societies due to sub-replacement fertility and population aging. In the United States, they are the second most numerous age demographic after Millennials. Generation X. This generation is generally defined as being born from 1965 to 1980. As children in the 1970s and 1980s, a time of shifting societal values, Gen Xers were sometimes called the latchkey generation, which stems from their returning as children from school to an empty home and needing to use a door key to let themselves in. This was a result of what is now called free-range parenting, plus increasing divorce rates and increased maternal participation in the workforce prior to widespread availability of childcare options outside the home. As adolescents and young adults in the 1980s and 1990s, Xers were dubbed the MTV generation, a reference to the music video channel, sometimes being characterized as slackers, cynical, and disaffected. Some of the many cultural influences as Gen X youth included a proliferation of musical genres with strong social tribal identity such as alternative rock, hip-hop, punk, post-punk, and heavy metal. The cohort has also been credited as entrepreneurial and productive in the workplace more broadly. Millennials. This generation is typically defined as people born from 1981 to 1996. As the first generation to use the internet in their teens, millennials have also been described as the first global generation. The generation is generally marked by elevated use of and familiarity with the internet, mobile devices, and social media. The term digital natives, which is now also applied to successive generations, was originally coined to describe this generation. Millennials have also been called the unluckiest generation because the average millennial has experienced slower economic growth since entering the workforce than any other generation in US history. The generation has also been weighed down by student debt and childcare costs. Millennials were born at a time of declining fertility rates around the world and are having fewer children than their predecessors. Generation Z. Researchers and popular media use the mid to late 1990s as starting birth years and the early 2010s as ending birth years of this generation. Most members of Generation Z are the children of Generation X or older millennials. As the first social generation to have grown up with access to the internet and portable digital technology from a young age, members of Generation Z, even if not necessarily digitally literate, have been dubbed digital natives. Moreover, the negative effects of screen time are most pronounced in adolescents as compared to younger children. Compared to previous generations, members of Generation Z tend to live more slowly than their predecessors. Generation Z teenagers are more concerned than older generations with academic performance and job prospects, and are better at delaying gratification than their counterparts from 1960s, despite concerns to the contrary. Around the world, members of Generation Z are spending more time on electronic devices and less time reading books than before, with implications for their attention spans, vocabulary, academic performance, and future economic contributions. Generation Alpha. Scientists and popular media use the early 2010s as starting birth years and the early to mid 2020s as ending birth years of this generation. Named after Alpha, the first letter in the Greek alphabet, Generation Alpha is the first to be born entirely in the 21st century and the third millennium. Members of Generation Alpha are mostly children of millennials. Generation Alpha has been born at a time of falling fertility rates across much of the world and experienced the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic as young children. For those with access, children's entertainment has been increasingly dominated by electronic technology, social networks, and streaming services, with interest in traditional television concurrently falling. Changes in the use of technology in classrooms and other aspects of life have had a significant effect on how this generation has experienced early learning compared to previous generations. Studies have suggested that health problems related to screen time, allergies, and obesity became increasingly prevalent in the late 2010s. Nowadays, we read and hear a lot about generations, but there are some important points to bear in mind whenever we come across a news story or research about generations. Firstly, generational timelines are not scientifically defined. The boundaries that place one person in Gen Z and another in the Millennial generation are not precise, definitive, or universally agreed on. People born near the boundaries of these generational groupings can feel particularly uncomfortable being linked with those much older or younger than them. Secondly, generational labels can lead to stereotypes and oversimplification. All millennials or all baby boomers are not the same, just as all Southerners, all Catholics, or all African American people are not the same. Shared experiences and identities should be recognized and at their best can even be empowering, but this shouldn't come at the expense of individuality. Thirdly, discussions about generation often focus on differences instead of similarities. And lastly, people change over time. For example, Gen Zers may change considerably after 20 to 30 years as they grow old. That's all from now. See you in the next video.